thank you all, and you're going to get to know our speakers. I'm going to let each one of them, as they are starting their talk, to tell you a little bit about who they are and where they came from. And I want to thank you all for making the time to be on the panel, Sean, Patrick, John, and Emma, and Westbrook. And before I forget, I want to thank all of our sponsors. We cannot do this without the support of Airgas. You see all of their names there, Bob Berliner and Berliner and Associates, Bolton and Company, Perkins Coie, George is over there, UCLA Business of Science Center, and VWR. It has a display outside, and some of the VWR people are here, so you need to interface with them. I'm going to ask each speaker to sort of limit their talk to what I give John the first presentation so he can tell us about Kythera and what they are looking for after they get FDA approval, and tell us a little bit about who you are. And then we're going to present to two biotech aesthetic companies and two device companies, emerging companies in this field. So they will tell their story and what they are looking for in order to move their companies from now till point P and so on. With that, John, the floor is all yours.
Good evening, everybody. My name is John Smither. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Kythera Biopharmaceuticals. Just by way of background, I actually started my career in public accounting at Ernst & Young. It was the farthest thing probably from biotech that one could get. And it wasn't until 1998 that, I can't say I stumbled across it. It was literally in my backyard. I went to work for Amgen. And I think I heard somebody say that there's a number of Amgen alum probably in the audience. And spent about 10 years there, where I cycled through pretty much most of the finance organization. That's not because they were trying to shuffle me out. It was just I had an opportunity to actually get experience in a variety of parts of it. Probably half of my career there was spent in Europe, where I got to work with Keith Leonard, who coincidentally happens to be one of the founders of Kythera. And we had the good fortune to launch 4 products in Europe and actually grow that business from what was about a $250 million business in Europe to $1.6 billion by the time I left. I left Amgen in late 2007 to join Kythera for a variety of reasons. The biggest one was the fact that I had worked with Keith Leonard and we had stayed in touch with one another. And I obviously had not irritated him so much that over in Europe that he didn't want to hire me. And I certainly enjoyed working with the guy, and I thought he had a great vision with respect to the start of the company, which I'll talk a little bit about. I'm a public company, so I am obligated to tell you I will be making some forward-looking statements and would ask you to please refer to our public filings and press releases that you can find on our website. I hate making that statement, but Heather's in the audience and she makes me say it, so I'm going to blame her. Kythera, actually, its original premise and start was to be a leading aesthetics company. And the thought process that went behind it really was Keith, and there were 3 other founders at the time, saw an opportunity which actually started in dermatology. Their belief was that there really had not been a lot of innovation in dermatology, and that thinking ultimately expanded to aesthetics. And there were several features of that decision that actually attracted them. One was it was cash pay. You didn't have to rely on the reimbursement system that is at least a byproduct of our medical system here in the US. It was what we refer to as happy medicine. There wasn't a lot of innovation, and if you could find interesting molecules, you could create a lot of value in starting a company around that molecule or a variety of molecules. The company was founded in 2005. I mentioned there were 4 original founders. One was Keith Leonard, another one by the name of Amit Munshi, who also was a former Amgen person that we had worked together with in Europe. There was an entrepreneur in residence, Versa at that particular time, Ned David, and then there was a dermatologist that was the founding chief medical officer, a guy by the name of Jane Birnbaum, that became the basis of the company. And they started the company with an A round. It was about $1 million, and really they didn't have an idea at that time. There was nothing inside. They had this idea of aesthetics, but they really had nothing to ultimately start the company with. Today, we're at approximately 106 employees. Ahmed was gracious enough to say we just came off a very successful advisory committee meeting with the FDA, where the panel voted 17-0 in favor of us getting approved by the FDA. I'll go over a little bit of our clinical data, a little bit about the product, but we've got an outstanding product, which is actually largely due to this forum here, because this is where we actually heard about it, which I'll talk about a little bit. And we're actually very, very well positioned where we have a PDUFA date. If that acronym doesn't mean anything to you, basically the FDA has a decision date of May 13th where they will tell us whether we're approved or not. And then hopefully on the success of a panel, we'll get the product approved and be on our way, you know, in the second half of this year and actually have the product on the market. A little bit about the company. I've touched on some of this. The other premise I failed to mention earlier was that we wanted to combine the idea of scientific rigor to the practice of aesthetic medicine. And for those of us who came out of Amgen, those were strong, robust clinical trials, and it was all about the data and making sure the data supported the premise of what it was you were trying to support. This idea of aesthetics and really, frankly, the baby boomers and the waves of the baby boomers in turning, wanting this better self-image about themselves. I'm sure many of you are familiar with products such as Botox or Juvederm or Restylane. This is really of that same ilk. And if you can think about it, when Botox came out, I think originally in '97 as a therapeutic, not as a cosmetic, it really started here, the forehead kind of above. Fillers came out as volumization in the mid-face of the section, and then up until really today, there was really nothing kind of below for the lower face, or at least the submental fat area, which is the area that we were focused on. We also were trying to find something that was of high value. High value not only to the enterprise and to our investors, but high value to the patient as well, meaning you can make small corrections to the face that patients are willing to pay for. So if you think about the level of correction that a Botox does or a filler does, it's really actually quite modest, but it has a striking outcome after the patient has been treated. And we're taking a similar approach for the submental fat region, which is this area directly below the chin. Our near-term focus, obviously, is coming off the panel, is launching the product in the US and Canada, which we are well positioned to do. We've actually started building up a medical affairs function. We're beginning to prepare for launch, assuming we get approved. We've actually hired our sales leadership. We've got probably by the middle of this year, we'll have probably 18 people in medical affairs. Most of those will be field-based. So we're really well on our way to building the company to get ready to launch this product. And what we think, one of the things that we think we're really good at is taking an initial concept and getting it through the clinic. We also happen to think we're going to be pretty good at commercialization. I'll talk a little bit about the management team. And I haven't talked a lot about future indications, but the only area we've tested this drug is really here in the submental fat area. We think there are other small areas of fat where this drug might be attractive. We don't think this is a drug suitable for, I'll call the midsection or the stomach, or large areas of fat. We think there are technologies today that frankly are probably better suited to do that than our drug. Long term, we're building a company. This was never intended to build what I'll call a build to flip company. We are constantly looking for new innovations. In fact, in February, we found a very interesting molecule out of the University of Pennsylvania. We actually bought the compound from Actelion, and we think this gives us a shot to come up with something to prevent hair loss. We'll be launching a proof of concept trial this year. Probably will start late this year, maybe early next year. We're hoping that within 2 years we'll find out really kind of whether we have something and whether it'll work. But it's those type of molecules that we're looking for, and if in fact, if it works, that's a huge commercial opportunity for the company, a huge opportunity, I think, for patients as well. And we think we're pretty capital efficient. I don't have a lot of slides in here in terms of our financing progression. I can tell you, since I've been with the company, almost every year we've raised money. I don't have to tell many of you in this room, these journeys are long and these journeys are costly. Although when you take a look at what we've invested so far in the product, relatively speaking, it's a pretty modest amount. This slide just gives you a little bit of a sense of the journey we have taken clinically, primarily around the main molecule, something we call ATX-101. We don't have a brand name yet. But the other thing, I'll point out a couple of other things. We didn't start out as a one-product company. In fact, we had several products in the clinic that failed for a variety of reasons. We actually started testing ATX-101 in lipomas, and it worked, but we didn't think the commercial opportunity there because the current standard of care is excision, and frankly, it was pretty cheap for people to get lipomas excised as opposed to using our drug. But the drug did work in lipomas. We also worked on a facial contouring agent that was a combination of proprietary chemistry and hyaluronic acids, which are the foundation of most popular fillers today, where you could literally inject this combination of chemistry and HA, shine a green light on it, and it would lock in place the form or the shape that you wanted. And our original concept was being able to basically put injectable chins in as opposed to a chin implant. It worked. The safety profile wasn't what we were expecting or would have desired. There were some antibody reactions that we didn't like, and so we discontinued that program. The other one we looked into was vitiligo. Vitiligo is a loss of pigmentation, which is quite severe, particularly in countries like India, for example, and many Asian countries. And there's a social stigma associated with it. We had come across this compound in India. It was actually a drug on the market, and we actually took this drug and reran it back through clinical trials. Again, we found a signal. We actually found that it worked, but it just didn't have the efficacy that we were hoping to find, and we ended up terminating that program as well. And the first one after ATX-101 was a product we had in-licensed from Novartis for actinic keratosis that we tested. We actually went through the trial pretty quickly. Sadly, that had no signal whatsoever. That one was a pretty easy one to kill, at least when we tested it from a clinical trial perspective. The other thing I would point out to you is just the rigor and the amount of clinical development activity that has gone on with ATX-101. This, I believe I'm correct in saying, really will be the most rigorous drug file submitted to the FDA for an aesthetic drug. Botox, by history, started out as a therapeutic drug, morphed into a cosmetic drug. The fillers actually get regulated as a device. So as a drug goes, this is a very robust clinical package that, frankly, we're quite happy about and quite proud of. I had the opportunity to sit in the panel meeting, and after the vote and after the panel meeting was completed, the FDA was actually quite complimentary about the company and the spirit of cooperation between the sponsor, that is us, Kythera, and the agency. And there was a lot of good interchange as we went through the clinical process in terms of how we designed the protocols, what the endpoints needed to be, and the robustness of the trials in terms of reaching efficacy points. That has all led up, as I mentioned, we had our panel meeting on March 9th, and we're well on our way getting ready and hopefully what will be a positive outcome on our PDUFA date and building the company to get ready for launch. The only other thing I will point out on that slide, because I know it's a very busy slide, somewhere along that continuum we actually sold the rights to ATX-101 to Bayer in 2010, and then we all ended up buying those rights back in early 2014. We wouldn't be here, frankly, if we had not attended this forum. We owe a great deal of gratitude for the SoCalBio Association, and we actually licensed the product based on a presentation made by two scientists, Mike Kolodny and Adam Rotunda, about an observation they had made on deoxycholate. And what they had actually done is they had titrated actually two chemicals, phosphatidylcholine and deoxycholate, and they realized that the prevailing theory at that time was phosphatidylcholine was the actual active ingredient, and what they discovered was it was not. And in fact, it was deoxycholate, and that became the foundation for our IP that really started the company. And our IP is mostly method of use, manufacturing, formulation. It's not composition of matter. Deoxycholate has been, frankly, in the public domain. It's in your bodies today. You could almost say since man has been, man and women have been walking on two legs, but it's been composition of matter was not available to us. But we think we've got a very robust patent estate that actually we think protects us as we get ready to commercialize this drug. The other thing I will mention around that is if you look at the basis of the company, the way we work is really a network of collaborations. So for example, the molecule and the compound that we recently acquired was a collaboration with the University of Pennsylvania. We had been working with Dr. Carastorellis for, at least 2 years. We'd been working on a program for 4 years. And that's typically how we work in terms of basic research, is through collaborations. A little bit about the molecule. It's a synthetic version. Actually, when we started out, it was a animal-derived version that we used to get from controlled herds out of New Zealand. And then based on our own work, we actually developed a synthetic version of this molecule. It comes with a variety of benefits ranging from, we think it strengthens, frankly, our patent estate, And I probably don't have to tell many of you, animal-derived material people generally like to stay away from, particularly in Europe, and we think that gives us an advantage commercially as well. Effectively, what it does, you inject it in the submental fat region. It's a sub-Q injection. It's a series of injections, and it ablates the fat cell. It literally breaks it open and releases the lipids in the extracellular space in this area, and then through your body, macrophages enter the area and clear out the cell debris, and the drug that we inject returns back to its natural pool. And your body naturally excretes deoxycholate, I think it's about 35% daily, and your pool returns back to its natural levels over a relatively short period of time. It stimulates a natural tissue response, meaning that the tissue is repairing itself because you're basically going in there and you're destroying fat cells. And then over time, those fat cells go away. We don't say permanent, we say durable. We have long-term safety data that goes out to 4 years where I think it's close to 85% of patients sustain their original correction 4 years later. As I mentioned, we've got patent protection from 2025 to 2032. It's primarily method of use formulation. There is a very narrow sliver that gives us a composition patent protection on the nature of the molecule, the synthetic molecule, and the worldwide patent estate. We have over 70 patents on file. This, I only included one picture just to give you a sense of a before and after. This is probably what I would describe as a typical patient that is showing up in the dermatologist or plastic surgeon's office. They tend to be predominantly women. Probably 90–95% of patients who receive aesthetic treatment are primarily women, although it is increasing a little bit more for men. They typically tend to be in their mid-40s, and they typically tend to be already getting Botox or fillers in the physician's office. So this was a woman who was 43. You can tell from her weight it was pretty stable both before and after. The acronyms to the right are acronyms for the different scales that are used to measure the endpoints after treatment. These are subjective scales, interesting enough. The FDA, particularly the Derm and Dental decision, this is the method of scale they like to use to measure efficacy. And the way it works is the clinician will actually measure the size of the chin of the patient. And what I mean by measure, it's an observation, and then they categorize the patient either as 0, meaning no submental fat, or 4, which is really an open-ended category. Think of a large chin. Think of Jabba the Hutt. I mean, it's just as an example of it's kind of an open category. And then everybody kind of in between. The patient does the same thing. The patient will assess themselves as well. And so you do that before you inject, and then you get to the end of the study and you remeasure it to see if there's been a change. So in this particular case, for this patient, she went from a moderate, which is a 2, down to a 0. That's how she rated herself, and that's also how the clinician rated her. And then we also measure satisfaction. What's not often talked about with aesthetic and aesthetic treatments is the psychological benefit. And I don't say that just for hyperbole reasons. Patients really do feel better about themselves, and that does translate into productivity of that patient. And that is a measure that we measured through satisfaction of their treatment after, both before and after we've given the drug. Skin laxity, as you might guess, might be a concern, and what we saw is that basically we didn't see really any change in skin laxity. Because one thing you don't want to do is remove some amount of fat or a large amount of fat and then have a bunch of skin that's very laxed and loose. We think this is a pretty big market. I'm going to quote you. In fact, I got something, if some of you are not familiar with it. There is a study that's put out by ASAPS. It stands for American Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgery. Just to give you a sense of the growth of this market, which I'm sure many of the panel members probably are also aware of. So for example, and I'm going to focus primarily on injectables. It covers other things like devices as well, such as breast implants or surgery. I'm just going to focus primarily on injectables. But if you use 1997 as an anchor, there were, let me just get my vision here, about, call it 1 million surgical cosmetic procedures, about 741 non-surgical, that's primarily injectable. And in 2014, I'm going to focus on the non-surgical piece, that grew to almost 9 million procedures. That just gives you a sense that over a relatively short period of time, you've got tremendous growth going on in this particular part of medicine, if you will. Most of that, again, is going to be women, although for men, it's also growing quite substantially. We think for Kythera, ATX 101 represents a $500 million opportunity just in the U.S. alone at peak year revenue. And we think it fits very well in existing physicians' practices who are already delivering injectable products such as Botox and fillers, for example. As I mentioned, the FDA Advisory Committee recommended to approve ATX 101. It is frankly pretty unheard of to hear of a 17-0 vote. Just a little bit of an advertisement for our CMO and our Clin Reg team. They did an amazing job. And what's not often highlighted is they actually started that journey well over a year ago. We hired Frederick, I think, in late 2013, I think, and immediately he hired a consulting firm that he had worked with in the past and started preparing for an advisory committee meeting. We did not know at that time whether we would have one or not. So this was a bet ahead. We made a substantial investment ahead on the belief that it likely would, and at least we wanted to be prepared. We went through 3 mock panels. I went to all 3. And I know the amount of preparation they had put into this. And they were extremely well prepared. They were outstanding in terms of how they presented it, how they worked with the FDA. And as I mentioned, the FDA was extremely complimentary of just how well the company and the team worked with the agency. I mentioned the PDUFA date. I will talk a little bit about the management team, but this is a management team that has been successful in launching large commercial products, both in aesthetics and outside of aesthetics, but more importantly within aesthetics, which I'll show you in just a moment. I talked a little bit about the panel meeting, the amount of preparation that went into it. Just a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. There were 19 panel members. I think 18 were voting. I don't know if you've ever witnessed one or seen a video of one, but it's a little bit like impaneling a jury, if you will. Some of our prep time was spent understanding who we thought might be on the panel, what their backgrounds were, what their voting record had been, what their area of expertise had been. When we went through mock interviews, we hired former panel members, we hired former FDA commissioners, we hired statisticians to really grill the team in order to get them prepped for this meeting. As I mentioned, this was something that was in a process for well over a year before we stood before them. One of the things that Ahmed asked me is, lessons learned with respect to the company. I've touched on some of them with respect as to how we prepared for the panel meeting. I will tell you now with almost 8 years of hindsight, I learned things I didn't know I was learning at the time. So as a finance guy, some of these will probably be obvious, and some of them being always make sure you got enough cash because you can never predict what's going to happen, and no matter how long you think it's going to take you twice as long, and no matter how much you think it's going to cost you twice as much is kind of my general lessons learned. The other thing, when I joined the company in late 2007, we thought we were going to go public in 2008. And if many of you remember, 2008, the world blew up and capital was not available, which goes back to my advice number 1. We were very fortunate in that we had great investors both in our VCs and our crossovers that came in some of our private rounds when we went public in 2012, when we raised money again in 2013, and we literally just raised money 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. Sorry, my brain's still a little fuzzy. And so I can't speak enough about the importance of developing relationships with investors over time, the amount of time that takes, and the importance of it, because they're getting to know you, and your credibility actually is really what I think wins the day when you're looking for people to invest in your company, and they're getting to know you as human beings, and that credibility is very important. Prepare, practice, which I touched on a little bit with respect to the panel meeting. The other thing, the other peek behind the curtain with respect to the panel meeting is one of the reasons we started so early was we wanted to incorporate how we were going to approach the panel meeting in the NDA that we ultimately submitted. And those 2 events are relatively far apart, meaning about a year. And that was part of the reason why we actually started early, because we wanted to make sure we had an idea of what the outcome might be, and therefore what we might need to put in the NDA in getting ready for the advisory committee meeting. A little bit about the management team. I touched a little bit on Keith Leonard and a little bit about his background. He had been with Amgen, I think, if I remember correctly, around 15 years. He was on a general manager track and, in fact, had spent time in finance. Believe it or not, he ran IT, he ran Europe, he had been in operations. He's a UCLA alum, which he is very proud of, and it will be the first to tell you. Frederick Bedingfield, I mentioned to you, is our Chief Medical Officer, former Allergan, was responsible for a number of the approvals on the aesthetic side. Elizabeth Sandoval, who will be up to bat very soon, is a 20-year Allergan alum. She launched Juvederm in the face of competition when Restylane was on the market with a company called Medicis. I gave you a little bit about my background, and then to the right, Tom Grady, who we just hired, is our VP of Sales. Ryan Irvine, who runs Medical Affairs, is a relatively recent hire. He came in 2014. And then Keith Klein, Susie, are again our former Amgen folks, as you can tell, as are Frank Watanabe and Doug Rich, who runs our CMC operations. Diane Stroman, who's head of regulatory, is an amazing person. We were very fortunate to grab her. I think much of our success at the panel is largely due to her efforts. And last but not least, the most important person on the slide is Heather Rowe, who's sitting in the front seat, who frankly has helped Keith and I along this journey. We brought her on board just ahead of the IPO, and frankly, she makes us look good and makes sure that we don't say things we're not supposed to say. Recent achievement, I think I pretty much touched on many of them as I went through my comments a little bit. Ahead of us is, frankly, getting this thing approved. We're getting ready to launch a registry trial that will help inform us about the marketplace. We're going to continue to file filings outside the U.S. Right now, we have filed in Switzerland, Australia, and Canada. We've brought this new molecule on board which we're really excited about. We're going to kick off our proof of concept, and we're going to continue to look for new and interesting and novel compounds and molecules to continue to grow the company. And with that, I will stop.